In the 1950s, many Americans were ditching rail as their primary way of traveling around the country, especially on long-distance routes, opting instead to take the much faster plane, the cheaper bus, or the thrilling experience of a road trip in a car. But the railroads of the time had one last trick up their sleeves to give passengers a reason to take the train, or so they hoped. With many people taking other means of transport across the United States, railroads were seeing a ridership decline, especially on their long-distance routes. But hope was not lost, as while many passengers who would normally ride in coach were instead taking the bus, those who wanted a private accommodation, however, were still opting for the train. The issue was that private accommodations were expensive because sleeping cars could hold significantly fewer people compared to coach cars. In stepped American railcar manufacturer Budd with a solution to that problem, the slumber coach. The slumber coach was a car full of private accommodations that were crammed in to allow railroads to charge a little more than a coach fare for a private room. A normal sleeping car of the time could sleep about 24 people, whereas a slumber coach could sleep almost double that at 40 in both single and double rooms. The car had a central aisle with rooms almost stacked on top of each other, with some being accessible by a small flight of steps to make maximum use of the space. Nevertheless, each room contained most of the amenities of a conventional sleeping car, just on a smaller scale. A total of 28 cars were built new or rebuilt by Budd and saw service on several railroads starting in 1956. These cars were popular, with most of the rooms being occupied on most trips, but even with this popularity, the continuing drop in airfare led most to leave for planes anyway. But the slumber coach definitely prolonged this decision for most. However, all the railroads that operated slumber coaches continued to do so as they were still generating some revenue, which was desperately needed at this time for American railroads. When the US government stepped in to operate intercity passenger services with the formation of Amtrak in 1971, the slumber coaches stuck around. Amtrak would continue to operate the entire fleet of slumber coaches, with them still proving popular into the 1980s. Amtrak had found the perfect use for them, running them on medium-distance overnight trains where a train would depart in the early to late evening and arrive the next day in the late to early morning. One such train, the Montrealer, was offering slumber coach tickets for an additional $16.50 over the price of a coach ticket, just $50 today for an upgrade from a coach seat to a private room. But all good things must come to an end, and being built in the 1950s and with it now being the 1990s, the cars were starting to show their almost 40 years of age, and were withdrawn throughout the 1990s, and most were scrapped, but a few were preserved. With the withdrawal of the slumber coach, there was no equipment for Amtrak to replace them with, as the roomettes, which are offered on modern equipment, are much larger and therefore more expensive, and coach seating just doesn't offer the same private space as a slumber coach. Many passengers wished for the return of the slumber coach, while others thought they were too small and cramped to be worth the low price. The slumber coach was an interesting attempt to try and entice people away from the airlines, and some believe it may have worked if it had been attempted sooner and on a larger scale. But nonetheless, they were a cheap way to have a room of your own for a price just a little more than a coach. Be sure to subscribe for more.